The storm that broke over the Appalachian hills was not an ordinary one. It arrived with a biblical fury, a rolling, black-fronted tempest that swallowed the stars and silenced the night creatures. Inside his small, isolated cabin, Preacher Elijah Stone watched the spectacle from his worn armchair, the single kerosene lamp casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mimic the chaos outside. The wind howled like a tormented soul, and each crack of thunder felt like a physical blow to the timbers of his home. He was a man accustomed to solitude, his faith a quiet, personal thing, but tonight the atmosphere felt charged with something more, something ancient and immense. As the storm reached its zenith, a fork of lightning struck so close the cabin shook, and the lamp flickered and died, plunging Elijah into darkness. In that sudden void, the world outside the window vanished, replaced by a light that was not of any storm. It was a searing golden radiance that filled the room without a source, a warmth that had no place in the chill mountain air. The sound of the wind and rain ceased, replaced by a profound silence that was heavier than any noise. Then, a presence filled the space, a weight of glory that pressed Elijah down into his chair, his breath catching in his throat. It was not a voice heard with ears, but a knowing etched directly into his soul, clear and undeniable. The command was simple, a directive of terrifying scope. He was to build an Arkansas, not for a flood of water, but for a deluge of fire, a cleansing inferno that would soon sweep across the world. He was to gather the chosen, the faithful, and construct a vessel of salvation in the wilderness. Visions flashed before his mind's eye. A great wooden ship, towering and immense, nestled in a hidden valley. He saw faces, people he did not yet know, looking to him with desperate hope. He felt the heat of the coming conflagration, a dry, scorching wind that promised utter desolation. The message was absolute, a divine imperative that brooked no question. He was the instrument, the new Noah for a doomed age. As suddenly as it had come, the presence withdrew. The golden light faded, and the sounds of the real storm rushed back in. The drumming rain, the groaning wind. The kerosene lamp sputtered back to life, its feeble glow now seeming impossibly mundane. Elijah found himself on his knees, though he had no memory of sliding from the chair. His body trembled, not from cold, but from the residual awe of the encounter. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden quiet of his own thoughts. He stayed there for a long time, on the rough-hewn plank floor, the storm's fury gradually receding into a soft, steady rain. The vision was burned into his mind, every detail crystalline and sharp. The weight of the command settled upon his shoulders, a burden so colossal it felt like it might crush him. Yet, intertwined with the fear was a thread of iron purpose, a certainty he had never known in all his years of quiet prayer. This was why he had been led to this solitude, this cabin, this life. It had all been a preparation. Pushing himself up, his joints protesting, Elijah stumbled to the small table where his Bible lay. He did not open it. Instead, he placed a shaking hand upon its worn leather cover and bowed his head. His prayer was not one of words, but of raw, unfiltered emotion. A torrent of fear, acceptance, and a desperate plea for the strength to see this impossible task through. The man who had been content with his lonely ministry was gone, replaced by a prophet with a fire in his soul and a divine blueprint etched upon his heart. The storm outside had passed, but the one within him had only just begun. The following Sunday dawned clear and brittle, the world washed clean by the storm, but Elijah Stone carried the tempest within him. He stood before the small, weathered congregation of the Pine Creek Chapel not as the gentle, familiar preacher they knew, but as a man fundamentally altered. The usual softness in his eyes had been replaced by a burning intensity, and his hands, which normally rested calmly on the pulpit, gripped the worn wood as if it were the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. He did not begin with a gentle greeting or a familiar hymn. Instead, his voice, usually a comforting baritone, cracked through the hushed air like a whip, telling them of a darkness gathering beyond their peaceful valley, a flood not of water, but of divine fire. He painted the coming cataclysm with words of terrifying vividness. He spoke of a sun that would blacken and a sky that would rain embers, of rivers boiling and mountains melting like wax. This was not a distant metaphor for sin, but a literal, imminent event, a judgment for a world grown rotten. His rhetoric was fiery, weaving threads of ancient scripture with the visceral imagery from his vision. He spoke of salvation, yes, but it was a salvation born of utter doom, a single chance for redemption offered only to those who would heed his call. He was no longer just a preacher offering solace. He was a prophet delivering an ultimatum from God himself. The small congregation sat frozen, a sea of stunned faces. The air, thick with the scent of old wood and beeswax, grew heavy with a new electric tension. For Widow Mary, sitting in her usual pew near the front with her young son Jacob, the preacher's words did not bring fear, but a startling, painful hope. Her life had been a long stretch of quiet hardship since her husband's passing, a gray landscape of survival. Elijah's vision, terrible as it was a purpose, a grand narrative that promised her and her son a place in a story larger than their own struggles. She felt a strange, fierce joy kindle in her chest, her hands tightening around Jacob's small one. The boy, wide-eyed, looked from the frantic preacher to his mother's transfixed face, sensing the gravity of the moment in the tremor of her grip. But not all were swept away. In the back pew, Thomas, a practical man who worked as a carpenter and measured the world in plumb lines and solid oak, felt a deep unease curdle into skepticism. He had known Elijah for years, had shared coffee and conversation with him, and the man he saw now was a stranger. The grandiosity of the claim, the sheer, impractical scale of building an ark in the mountains, it struck Thomas not as divinity, but as delusion. He shifted in his seat, his brow furrowed, the seeds of doubt taking root as he listened to the descriptions of a fire flood that defied all natural law. Yet, even for the skeptics, Elijah's raw, desperate charisma was a potent force. His conviction was a physical thing, radiating from him in waves, and his deep, resonant voice held a magnetism that was difficult to resist. He spoke of community, of a chosen few banding together against the end of all things, and the appeal was primal. As the sermon reached its crescendo, a handful of faces in the crowd began to mirror his fervor. Their initial shock melted into a zealous light, their postures straightening as if they had been personally called to arms. They saw not a madman, but a Messiah for a modern apocalypse. When Elijah finally fell silent, his chest heaving and his shirt damp with sweat, the silence in the chapel was profound. It was not the peace of prayer, but the charged quiet of a precipice. The first fragile threads of a following had been spun, some drawn by the promise of salvation, and others, like Thomas, held in place by a grim, watchful caution, waiting for the first crack in the preacher's newfound certainty. The scent of wood smoke and simmering stew wove through the pines, a humble incense for a congregation born of prophecy. Elijah's cabin, once a solitary refuge, now hummed with a nervous energy as his initial followers gathered in the clearing before it. They stood in small, uncertain clusters, the fervor of the sermon still bright in some eyes, while in others, a cautious practicality lingered. Elijah moved among them, his presence a calming, authoritative force. He clasped shoulders, offered quiet words of blessing, his gaze sweeping over the 24 souls who had answered his call. This was the seed, the first flicker of the community that would weather the coming fire. Inside the cabin, space was a precious commodity. Bodies pressed together on rough-hewn benches and stools, their knees nearly touching as bowls of venison stew were passed hand to hand. The meal was a simple, solemn affair, more sacrament than supper. Elijah did not eat, but watched them, his eyes cataloging their faces, their strengths, their spirits. When the last spoon was laid down, he rose, and the quiet murmurs ceased instantly. He stood before the hearth, the firelight carving deep shadows into his face, making him appear both ancient and terribly alive. He began not with commands, but with prayer, a long, rolling invocation that bound them together in a web of shared purpose and divine supplication. Then, he laid out the vision in practical terms. With a piece of charcoal, he sketched the ark's dimensions on the smooth surface of the hearthstone. a colossal, three-decked vessel that seemed to dwarf the very cabin they sat in. He spoke of gopher wood, though he admitted they would use the sturdy oak and pine of the mountains, and outlined the monumental task ahead. But this was not a sermon of doom. It was a call to creation. He began to assign roles, his voice firm and sure, matching tasks to talents he seemed to intuit. The strong-backed farmers and woodsmen were marked for felling and hauling. Those with clever hands, like Thomas, were singled out for the precise work of joinery and shaping. The women who knew sewing and preserving were tasked with gathering and storing provisions, a vast larder for their voyage through an ocean of flame. Mary listened, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. When Elijah's gaze fell upon her, it was with a particular softness. He asked for someone to keep a record, a chronicle of their labor and their faith. Without a moment's hesitation, her hand shot into the air, her voice clear and steady as she volunteered. The duty felt sacred, a way to weave her and Jacob's story directly into the fabric of this divine mission. She would be the ark's memory, its scribe, and the honor of it filled her with a fierce, blinding pride. Thomas, however, remained a still, silent point in the room. He absorbed the details of the plan with a carpenter's mind, mentally calculating the board feet of lumber, the thousands of man-hours, the sheer impossibility of it all in the face of an Appalachian winter. He saw the fervent light in the other's eyes, the way they hung on Elijah's every word as if it were a lifeline, and he felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. This was more than faith. It was a fever, and he feared the crash when reality inevitably intervened. He offered no objection, voiced no doubt, but his silence was a louder protest than any words could have been, a pocket of reason in a room growing thick with devotion. As the evening wore on and a final prayer was shared, a subtle shift occurred. The initial apprehension began to melt away, replaced by a burgeoning sense of fellowship. They were no longer just individuals who had heard a frightening sermon. They were a body, each with a function, a purpose, a place. They were the chosen, bound by a shared secret and a shared task of cosmic importance. Stepping out into the crisp night air, the stars sharp and cold above them, they did not scatter to their homes. They lingered, speaking in hushed, excited tones, their breath pluming in the moonlight. Bonds were forming not just of shared belief, but of a community forged in the face of the end of the world. The path into the heart of the Appalachians was not a path at all, but a memory of one, a faint scar woven through a dense tapestry of thorns, rock, and ancient gnarled roots. Elijah led the way, his figure a stark, dark silhouette against the deep greens and browns of the forest, moving with a certainty that seemed to bend the wilderness itself to his will. Behind him, his small band of followers trudged, their breaths forming ragged clouds in the chill morning air, their boots slipping on moss-slick stones and sinking into damp, leaf-strewn earth. The further they moved from the known world, the more the woods seemed to close in around them, the canopy overhead knitting together to block out the sun, casting the world below in a perpetual verdant twilight. The air grew thick with the scent of damp decay and pine resin, a primal perfume that spoke of a world untouched by human hands. The journey was a brutal test of both body and spirit. Men and women alike stumbled, their clothes snagging on clutching brambles, their hands raw from catching themselves on rough bark. The massive clearing Elijah had promised felt like a myth, a destination that receded with every painful step. Muscles ached, and lungs burned with the thin, cold air of the ascending trail. Whispers of fatigue and doubt began to ripple through the group, soft as the rustle of leaves, as the initial fervor of their mission met the unyielding reality of the mountain. Thomas moved with a grim, efficient silence, his carpenter's eyes noting the impracticality of their route, the sheer lunacy of hauling tons of lumber along such a treacherous passage. Seeing the weariness threatening to consume them, Elijah paused at a small, rocky outcrop overlooking a mist-shrouded valley. He did not offer them rest or water first, but something he deemed more vital, a story. His voice, though low, carried through the hushed woods with a resonant power, weaving the ancient tale of Noah into the fabric of their own struggle. He spoke not of the calm after the flood, but of the 100 years of labor, the ridicule, the bone-deep exhaustion that must have plagued the first ark builder. He painted a picture of faith as a relentless, physical act, a hammer blow after hammer blow driven by a conviction that could not be seen, only felt. He spoke of the Rainbow Covenant not as a pretty symbol, but as a hard-won promise after an epoch of doubt and toil. As his words washed over them, a subtle transformation occurred. The slumped shoulders of the followers began to straighten. The looks of exhaustion were replaced by a glimmer of renewed purpose. They were not just a group of people lost in the woods. They were the spiritual descendants of that biblical patriarch, their own blistered hands and aching backs a testament to a faith that was being forged in the fire of present hardship. Mary listened, her weariness forgotten, her heart swelling with a holy pride. She saw not a difficult hike, but a pilgrimage, each painful step a prayer, each obstacle a divine test of their worthiness. When they finally broke through a final wall of laurel and saw it, the clearing, a collective gasp rippled through the group. It was a perfect, bowl-shaped expanse cradled by protective ridges, a secret meadow bathed in a shaft of golden sunlight that pierced the canopy like a benediction. A small, clear stream chuckled along its edge. It was exactly as Elijah had described it from his vision, a sanctuary prepared for them. The sight washed away the last vestiges of their fatigue, replacing it with a wave of awe that felt like a physical force. Their faith, tested and tempered on the difficult trail, now felt unshakable, a solid thing inside them. They had arrived. The journey was over, and the true work, the sacred work of building their salvation, was ready to begin. The first strike of the axe was a sound that shattered the mountain's ancient peace, a sharp, percussive crack that echoed through the clearing like a declaration of war against the natural order. It was followed by another, and then another, until the air thrummed with a chaotic symphony of iron biting into wood, of saws groaning through fibrous flesh, of men and women grunting with effort. The clearing, once a serene cathedral of dappled light and birdsong, was now a raw, open wound in the forest's side, a chaotic workshop dedicated to an impossible dream. The scent of freshly split pine and disturbed, loamy earth rose like a pagan incense, thick and potent in the crisp air. Elijah stood at the center of the maelstrom, a still point of furious energy. He did not swing an axe or lift a log. His labor was of a different kind. He moved ceaselessly along the nascent outline of the ark, a colossal skeleton of stakes and twine that marked its terrifying dimensions in the grass. His voice, a constant, rolling baritone, rose above the din, not in command, but in ceaseless prayer. He quoted scripture, verses from Genesis weaving seamlessly with Psalms, his words a spiritual mortar meant to bind the physical lumber. He laid his hands on felled trunks, blessing them before they were dragged by teams of straining followers to the central building site. His eyes burned with an unearthly light, seeing not the chaotic present, but the finished vessel of his vision, a wooden mountain that would cradle them from the storm of fire. The followers worked with a desperate, driven belief, their faces smudged with dirt and sweat. They were farmers and seamstresses, blacksmiths and storekeepers, their soft hands blistering and bleeding as they learned the brutal trade of shipbuilding. They shaped the massive keel timber, a gargantuan oak beam that was the spine of the ark, using adzes and drawknives to carve its curve under Elijah's exacting direction. Their faith was a tangible force, a fuel that powered tired muscles and silenced the whispers of pain. They saw each splinter as a badge of honor, each drop of sweat as a holy offering. They were building not just a boat, but their own salvation, and the monumental scale of the task only served to magnify the grandeur of their purpose in their own eyes. It was Thomas, his own skilled hands smoothing a joint with a precision born of a lifetime of craftsmanship, who finally broke from the rhythm of prayer and labor. He approached Elijah as the preacher stood overseeing the placement of the keel into its prepared trench. Thomas's voice was low, meant only for Elijah's ears, but it cut through the spiritual fervor with the cold edge of practicality. He gestured at the massive beam, then at the surrounding forest, the steep walls of the clearing. He spoke of leverage and pulleys, of the sheer tonnage of wood that would need to be lifted and secured, of the coming winter that would freeze the ground and make their work 1,000 times more difficult. He questioned not the vision, but the method, proposing simpler, more achievable steps, a foundation of reason upon which the miracle could be built. Elijah turned his head slowly, his gaze settling on Thomas. The intense, zealous light in his eyes did not flicker. It hardened. He did not address the specifics of the carpentry, the physics of the build. Instead, his voice, though quiet, carried a dismissive finality that was more devastating than any shout. He spoke of Noah, who built without question, who followed the divine blueprint to the cubit. He called Thomas's concerns not wisdom, but the whispers of doubt, the very poison that had left the unbelievers to drown in the first great deluge. He placed a hand on the rough-hewn oak of the keel, a possessive, almost loving gesture. The Lord would provide the strength, he said, and the Lord would provide the way. Their only task was to have faith enough to lift the hammer. He then turned his back, his prayers resuming, leaving Thomas standing alone in the churned-up earth, his practical warnings withering in the heat of absolute conviction. The divide between them was no longer just one of belief but of reality itself, and in that clearing, faith was the only reality that held any power. The sermons changed. They were no longer calls to creation, but pronouncements of a coming, agonizing end. Elijah's voice, once a vessel for hope, now carved the evening air with visions of a world consumed. He stood before his followers in the firelit clearing, the skeletal ribs of the ark looming behind him like the bones of some great, dead beast, and he spoke of the flood of fire. It was not a metaphor. He described it in excruciating sensory detail, the air itself turning to furnace breath, searing the lungs with every gasp, the ground cracking open like a baked crust, vomiting rivers of molten rock, the sky not of smoke, but of solid, rolling flame, descending to scald the very tops of the mountains. His words were not a warning, but a promise, a vivid, horrifying prophecy of a world purged in divine agony. He spoke of the ark not as a ship, but as a coffin for the old world and a womb for the new. And he spoke of its passengers. Only the purest would board, he thundered, his eyes sweeping over their upturned, soot-streaked faces. Only those whose faith was an unbreachable fortress, whose devotion was absolute and without the faintest crack of hesitation. His gaze seemed to linger on individuals, judging, weighing the substance of their souls. He spoke of doubt not as a human frailty, but as a spiritual contagion, a leprosy of the soul that would bar the gates of salvation. Fear was his new tool, and he wielded it with the skill of a master craftsman, hammering it into their hearts until it became a constant, cold companion to their faith. The community, once bound by shared purpose, was now being bound by a shared, meticulously cultivated terror. Mary sat on a rough-hewn log, her record book forgotten in her lap. She watched Elijah, the man whose vision had given her life meaning, and felt a conflict stirring in her chest, cold and unwelcome. The fervent hope that had first ignited within her now felt tainted, its bright flame guttering in the harsh wind of his new sermons. She saw the way the others looked at one another now, not with fellowship, but with a furtive, suspicious anxiety, each wondering if their neighbor's faith was pure enough, if some hidden doubt might condemn them all. The unity he had forged was beginning to curdle into a collection of isolated, fearful souls. Her concern crystallized into a sharp, personal dread as she looked down at her son. Jacob, who had once followed the work with a boy's wide-eyed wonder, now huddled close to her side, his small body tense. His eyes, fixed on Elijah, were pools of pure, uncomprehending fear. He no longer saw a prophet. He saw a man describing a nightmare from which there was no waking. He flinched at the descriptions of burning skies, his small hand clutching Mary's skirt so tightly his knuckles were white. The divine mission that had given her purpose was now stealing her son's innocence, replacing it with a terror that haunted his waking hours and surely his dreams. The salvation Elijah promised began to feel like a different kind of damnation. Across the clearing, Thomas stood apart, his arms crossed over his chest. Where the others heard divine truth, he heard the carefully constructed rhetoric of a man losing his grip on reality, or worse, a man building a prison of the mind. He saw the fear in Jacob's eyes, the way Mary's shoulders slumped with a new weight, the subtle shift in the group's dynamic from a community to a cult. Elijah's insistence on purity and his vilification of doubt were not the markers of a loving God, but the tactics of a despot securing his power. Each dark sermon, each vivid description of hellfire, did not strengthen Thomas's belief but deepened the chasm of his skepticism. He watched Elijah, no longer as a misguided preacher, but as a dangerous force, a storm contained within a man, and he knew, with a cold certainty, that this particular storm would not save anyone. It would only break them. The first fisher appeared not with a shout, but with a quiet observation, a simple question Thomas voiced as he and Mary sorted through a pile of warped planks deemed unfit for the ark's hull. The morning was cold, their breath pluming in the air, and the rhythmic sounds of construction around them had taken on a sluggish, weary tempo. Thomas held up a board, its grain twisted like a pained spine. He pointed out, his voice low and measured, that just last week, Elijah had declared such flaws to be signs of a tree's unique spirit, to be incorporated as a testament to God's diverse creation. Yet this morning, the same preacher had condemned the entire batch as symbols of imperfection, of a faith that was not straight and true. It was a small thing, an inconsistency in the grand, terrifying scope of their mission, but to Thomas, it was a crack in the foundation of Elijah's divine certainty, and he watched as the realization dawned in Mary's eyes. He found his chance to speak with her alone later that day, by the chattering stream where she had gone to fetch water. The water was icy, numbing her fingers as she dipped the bucket, but the cold she felt inside was deeper. Thomas stood beside her, his presence a solid, pragmatic contrast to the feverish atmosphere of the camp. He did not speak in accusations or anger, but with a weary concern that was more persuasive than any rant. He listed the inconsistencies he had collected like grim trophies, the changing dimensions of the storage rooms Elijah described from one day to the next, the contradictory interpretations of omens in the forest, the way the prophesied timeline of the fire flood seemed to shift and recede like a mirage. He spoke of the sheer physical impossibility of their task, not to dissuade her, but to highlight the growing chasm between the preacher's words and the unyielding reality of wood, time, and gravity. He was not questioning God, he insisted gently. He was questioning the sanity of the man who claimed to be his sole mouthpiece. Mary listened, the weight of the full water bucket forgotten in her hand. Thomas's words found fertile ground in the soil of her own unease, the fear she had for Jacob, the cold dread that had replaced her initial fervor. She looked back toward the clearing, where the ark's skeleton stood against the gray sky, and saw not a vessel of salvation, but a cage being built around their lives. Her loyalty to Elijah, once the cornerstone of her new existence, now felt like a chain. She was torn between the memory of the hope he had given her and the chilling plausibility of Thomas's doubts. The faith that had warmed her now felt like a shroud, and the struggle within her was a silent, violent thing. A war between the need to believe and the terrifying possibility that she had pledged her son's future to a beautiful, devastating delusion. The effects of this burgeoning doubt began to bleed into the work itself. The frantic, zealous energy that had characterized the first weeks of construction ebbed away, replaced by a mechanical, joyless labor. The rhythmic strikes of hammers lost their syncopated certainty, becoming sporadic and hesitant. Whispers began to weave through the sounds of sawing and chopping, no longer about scripture or shared purpose, but about Thomas's questions, about the preacher's increasingly erratic behavior, about the gnawing fear that they were all laboring toward a mirage. Followers who had once worked side by side in unified purpose now worked in isolated pockets, their eyes avoiding each other, the community's unity fraying into a collection of individual, anxious souls. The ark, meant to be their unifying salvation, was instead becoming the focal point of their division, its towering, unfinished frame a monument to a faith that was beginning to show its fatal cracks. It started as a dry, rasping sound, a small, helpless noise that seemed too frail to carry any significance in the vast, work-filled clearing. Young Jacob, fetching a dipper of water from the shared bucket, was suddenly racked by it, his small frame convulsing as the cough tore from his chest, harsh and persistent. He recovered, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, his face flushed with embarrassment more than anything else. Mary rushed to his side, her hand on his forehead, her mother's instinct sending a jolt of primal alarm through her. The skin was warm, too warm, and a fine sheen of sweat glistened on his temples despite the autumn chill. It was the first crack in the dam, a tiny, almost imperceptible fissure through which a true and tangible disaster began to seep into their world of prophesied fire. Elijah was informed of the boy's condition as he oversaw the raising of a new rib into the ark's frame. He listened, his gaze fixed on the massive timber swinging into place, his expression not one of concern, but of solemn contemplation. He called the followers together, their faces etched with the day's grime and a new, nascent worry. Standing before them, with Jacob's occasional, muffled coughs punctuating the silence, he reframed the illness. This was not a sickness of the body, he declared, his voice resonating with grim authority, but a test of the spirit. It was a divine fever, sent to burn away the dross of their lingering worldly attachments, to purify their faith in the crucible of physical suffering. He spoke of Job, of his afflictions, and how his unwavering devotion was ultimately rewarded. The cough, he insisted, was a blessing in disguise, a sign that God was personally scrutinizing each and every one of them, separating the wheat from the chaff. Trusting in this divine diagnosis, the community turned to the old ways, the remedies passed down through generations of mountain folk. Mary and the other women gathered bunches of mullein and wild cherry bark, brewing them into bitter, steaming teas that Jacob sipped with a grimace. They made poultices of pine resin and crushed garlic, slathering them on his narrow chest, the pungent smell mingling with the scent of sawdust and sweat. They prayed over him, their hands laid upon his feverish body, their voices rising in a desperate chorus of supplication. For a day, the remedies seemed to hold the sickness at bay, and a fragile hope bloomed. But then, the dry, hacking sound was echoed from another corner of the camp. One of the woodcutters, a strong man named Abel, began to cough into his hand, his broad shoulders shaking with the effort. The next day, a young woman stitching a sailcloth was seized by a similar fit. The illness, whatever its origin, was no longer an isolated test for a single boy. It was a creeping vine, spreading its tendrils through the heart of their sanctuary. A new kind of fear began to grow, one far more immediate and visceral than the dread of a prophesied fire flood. It was the fear of the unseen, of the breath of the person standing next to you, of the shared dipper of water, of the close quarters in their makeshift shelters. The fervent unity of the group began to fracture under the strain of this biological threat. People began to eye each other with a wary suspicion, subtly distancing themselves, their faith suddenly insufficient armor against this common, creeping malady. The communal pot of stew was approached with hesitation, and the warmth of the campfire circles was replaced by isolated huddles. It was Thomas who gave the fear its name. He watched the spread of the illness with a growing, cold certainty. He saw the telltale flush of the cheeks, the worsening cough that sometimes brought a speckle of blood to a handkerchief, the slow, wasting fatigue that was beginning to sap the strength from the strongest among them. He remembered tales from his own childhood, of a sickness that had swept through a neighboring hollow, leaving empty cabins and fresh-turned earth in its wake. He found Mary one evening, her face pale with exhaustion and fear as she mopped Jacob's brow. His voice was low and grave, stripped of all speculation. He didn't speak of divine tests or spiritual purification. He spoke a single, terrifying word that carried the weight of a death sentence in those isolated hills: consumption. And in that moment, the true nature of the disaster became horrifyingly clear. The real flood was not one of fire in some distant future, but a slow, insidious tide of disease, already moving among them, its damp breath a far greater threat than any prophesied flame. The shadow that fell over the camp was not cast by the mountains or the gathering clouds, but by the preacher's decree. Elijah stood before his followers, his face a mask of grim resolve, and declared the clearing a sanctified island, a fortress of faith from which no one was permitted to depart. His voice, once a conduit for divine promise, now rang with the iron clang of command. He spoke of a contagion far more dangerous than any physical sickness, the contagion of doubt, carried on the whispers of outsiders, on the faithless breath of the world they had left behind. To leave was to betray the mission, to risk infecting their sacred endeavor with the spiritual poison of disbelief. The Ark was their only salvation, and its construction site was now their entire world, its boundaries as fixed and final as the walls of the vessel itself. By the next morning, the abstract command had become a physical reality. Two of the most zealous followers, men whose eyes burned with a feverish devotion, took up positions at the head of the trail that led back to the world. They were not armed with anything more than grim expressions and crossed arms, but their presence was a more effective barrier than any locked gate. They stood as silent, judgmental sentinels, their gaze sweeping over the camp, a constant, visible reminder that the path to their old lives was now closed. The air in the clearing, already thick with the scent of illness and wood smoke, grew heavier still, charged with a new, claustrophobic tension. The wide, open sky above suddenly felt like a lid, and the beautiful, secluded bowl in the mountains now felt exactly like what it had become, a prison of their own making. Thomas watched the posting of the guards with a cold fury crystallizing in his chest. He saw the fear in the eyes of the others, the way they glanced toward the trail and then quickly away, as if the very thought of escape was a sin. He waited until the community was gathered for their meager evening meal, the sounds of coughing a ragged counterpoint to the crackling fire. Then he stood, his figure solid and unyielding. He did not shout. His words were measured, each one a stone dropped into the stagnant pond of their fear. He spoke of Jacob's worsening condition, of the spread of the fever, of the desperate, practical need for a doctor, for medicine, for help from the world Elijah had condemned. He argued that true faith was not about hiding from reality, but about using the tools God provided to overcome it. His plea was not for rebellion, but for reason, for the preservation of the very lives they were supposedly working to save. Elijah rose to meet the challenge, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on Thomas with a terrifying intensity. The firelight seemed to gather in his gaze, turning it into twin points of burning condemnation. He did not address the sickness, the suffering, the practical need for aid. Instead, he turned Thomas's words against him, twisting the plea for help into a confession of profound faithlessness. He spoke of Abraham and Isaac, of the willingness to sacrifice even a son upon the altar of belief. He painted Thomas not as a concerned man, but as a modern-day Satan, tempting the faithful away from their covenant with a serpent's tongue of false compassion. His voice rose, thundering through the clearing, branding Thomas's pragmatism as a spiritual disease more virulent than the consumption itself. The accusation hung in the air, a toxic cloud that seemed to seep into the very souls of the listeners, turning their fear into a weapon against the one man who offered a tangible solution. In the wake of the confrontation, a profound and unsettling silence descended upon the camp. The followers retreated into themselves, their faces pale and drawn. They were trapped, caught between the terrifying certainty of the sickness in their midst and the even more terrifying wrath of the prophet they followed. The sense of community, already frayed by fear and illness, shattered completely, replaced by a collection of isolated, terrified individuals, each alone with their coughing, their fever, and their crumbling faith. Mary sat in the shelter she shared with Jacob, holding his hot, trembling hand. She listened to the ragged sound of his breathing and looked from his suffering face to the unfinished, looming skeleton of the ark outside. The grand purpose that had once filled her with holy fire now felt like a cruel joke, a beautiful lie that was costing her son his health, his safety, perhaps his life. Elijah's words about Abraham echoed in her mind, but they brought no comfort, only a cold, sickening horror. The faith that had been her anchor was now the chain dragging her and her child into the depths. As she watched the guards pacing at the edge of the camp, their figures dark against the twilight, she felt the last of her certainty waver and then break, crumbling into a dust of despair and a desperate, silent prayer for a salvation that looked nothing like the one the preacher promised. The sickness moved through the camp not with the roar of a prophet's fire, but with the quiet, insidious persistence of a shadow lengthening at dusk. Jacob's initial, isolated cough was no longer an anomaly. It had become the camp's grim chorus. The sound echoed from the rough-hewn shelters, a dry, rattling percussion beneath the dwindling sounds of construction. It was in the woodcutter Abel, whose powerful frame was now stooped and trembling, his axe strokes feeble and wide of their mark. It was in the young seamstress, her hands, once deft with a needle, now shaking as she tried to stitch a sail, her work interrupted by fits that left her gasping and pale. A low-grade fever seemed to radiate from the community itself, a collective warmth of illness that hung in the air, mingling with the scent of pine and despair. The vibrant energy of the chosen had been replaced by a listless, aching fatigue, a slow-motion collapse that was far more terrifying than any vision of a burning sky. Thomas moved among the afflicted with a grim, methodical purpose. His carpenter's eye for detail now turned to the symptoms of the body. He noted the way the fever burned brightest in the afternoons, the telltale drenching night sweats that left clothes and bedding sodden, the gradual, relentless wasting of flesh from strong bones. He watched the handkerchiefs, once white, now stained with rusty speckles of blood, hastily tucked away in pockets or sleeves. He remembered the stories from his youth, the hollows where whole families had been claimed by a relentless, consumptive cough, leaving behind only empty cabins and the fresh-turned earth of graveyards. This was not a divine test. It was a pattern, a recognizable earthly scourge. His investigation led him not to prayer, but to observation. He tracked the sickness back, patient zero in this isolated epidemic, to a family who had joined them just a week before the coughing began. A family who had come from a town downriver where, he now recalled hearing, a sickness had been quietly spreading. Armed with this terrible certainty, Thomas sought out Elijah. He found the preacher not at the ark, but on his knees before a large, flat stone he used as an altar, his head bowed in fervent prayer. The skeletal ribs of the vessel loomed behind him, a stark, ironic backdrop to the very real plague consuming his followers. Thomas did not wait for the prayer to end. His voice, though low, cut through the murmured scripture with the force of a physical blow. He laid out his evidence with the precision of a prosecutor, the specific symptoms, the timeline, the origin point from the outside world. He spoke the word aloud, giving the shadow a name: tuberculosis. It was not a punishment from God, he insisted, his voice tight with controlled anger, but a disease, a bacterium, brought from the town Elijah had condemned, and now running rampant in the close, malnourished, and exhausted conditions of their camp. Elijah slowly rose from his knees. He turned, and his face was not that of a man presented with troubling news, but of a prophet whose divine narrative was being challenged. The intensity in his eyes had not dimmed. If anything, it had hardened, crystallized into an unbreachable fortress of belief. He looked past Thomas, his gaze sweeping over the ailing camp, seeing not sick people, but symbols in a grand, spiritual drama. He denied the evidence, not with a counter-argument, but with a flat, absolute rejection of its very premise. The fever, the cough, the weakness, these were not the work of some invisible germ. They were the scourge of a disappointed God. He thundered, his voice rising to carry across the clearing. They were a divine rebuke for the community's collective insufficiency, for the doubts that Thomas himself had sown like poisonous seeds. The sickness was a purifying fire, he declared, meant to burn away the unfaithful so that only the truly pure would remain to board the ark. To seek a doctor or medicine would be to spit in the face of God's chosen method of selection, to prioritize the temporary vessel of the body over the eternal salvation of the soul. His denial was a wall, high and impenetrable, built not of reason, but of a faith that had curdled into fanaticism, leaving the sick to suffer as proof of his prophecy. The evidence was a quiet, damning thing, gathered not in a flash of revelation but in the grim, methodical accumulation of detail. Thomas had spent the hushed, fever-ridden hours of the previous night not in prayer, but in observation and recollection, his mind a ledger of suffering. He noted the specific, racking cough that tore through the camp, the telltale blood-flecked handkerchiefs, the relentless fever that spiked each afternoon and left its victims drenched and shivering by night. He remembered the family from Millersburg, the ones who had arrived with a persistent hackle in the father's throat, a detail dismissed in the fervor of their arrival. He recalled the rumors, whispers from the last supply run weeks ago, of a wasting sickness moving through the lower valleys. He had even found, tucked away in the belongings of the woodcutter Abel, a crumpled handbill warning of a tuberculosis outbreak and urging citizens to seek medical attention. These fragments, insignificant on their own, formed a mosaic of terrifying clarity when pieced together. The disaster was not a future event of divine wrath. It was a present, biological reality, a plague they had unwittingly carried into their sanctuary, where exhaustion and close quarters had given it fertile ground to flourish. He gathered the community at the first light of a pale, sickly dawn. They came slowly, their movements sluggish with fatigue and illness, their faces gaunt and etched with a fear that had become a permanent resident in their eyes. Thomas stood before them, not on a pulpit of stone, but on the churned, muddy earth near the ark's silent, skeletal frame. In his hands, he held not a Bible, but the small, tangible proofs of his investigation. The handbill, a list of symptoms he had meticulously compiled. His quiet, reasoned voice a stark contrast to the thunderous prophecies they were accustomed to. He laid it out for them with the patience of a schoolmaster, connecting the dots from the outside world to their own suffering. He spoke of bacteria and contagion, of lungs scarred and struggling for air, of a sickness that respected no divine selection process, preying on the faithful and the doubter alike. He pointed to the unfinished ark, a monument to their isolation, and named it not their salvation, but their tomb, a structure that had kept them trapped with the very thing that was killing them. Elijah watched from the periphery, his arms crossed, his face a granite mask of disapproval. As Thomas finished, his final, quiet plea for reason hanging in the chill air, the preacher stepped forward. The fire of his vision was still in his eyes, but it was a cold fire now, burning with the intensity of a man whose entire reality was under siege. He did not look at the evidence, did not address the specifics of Thomas's claims. Instead, he lifted his gaze to the haggard faces of his followers, his voice rolling out not in reasoned argument, but in a wave of pure, defiant faith. He called Thomas's findings the whispers of the serpent, a clever fiction designed to lead them from the path of righteousness. The sickness, he insisted, his voice rising to a familiar, thunderous pitch, was a refiner's fire, sent by God to test the metal of their souls. To acknowledge a worldly cause was to deny God's hand in their purification, to choose the frail wisdom of man over the inscrutable plan of the divine. A heated silence followed, thick and suffocating. Then, a voice, small but clear, cut through it. It was Mary. She stepped away from the shelter where her son lay burning with fever, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a new, terrible understanding. She looked from Thomas, holding his pathetic, paper proofs, to Elijah, standing in defiant, majestic denial. She saw the truth not in the handbill, but in the heat of her son's skin, in the rattle of his breath, in the hollows deepening in his cheeks. The grand, terrifying vision of a flood of fire was a phantom, a beautiful, devastating distraction. The real cataclysm was here, in this clearing, in the wasting bodies of the people around her. It was a quiet, creeping thing, far more mundane and far more deadly than any prophecy. Her faith, which had been a shield, now felt like a blindfold she had willingly worn. As her gaze met Thomas's, she gave a single, sharp nod. In that simple gesture, she crossed a line, siding not with the man who promised salvation from a distant inferno, but with the one who was fighting the very real fire already consuming them from within. The true disaster had a name, and it was not the wrath of God, but the slow, merciless work of a microscopic killer. The plan was born not in a shout of defiance, but in the hushed, urgent whispers exchanged over the ragged breaths of the sick. It was a fragile thing, woven from desperation and the last vestiges of practical hope, a secret shared in the shadowed corners of the camp where Elijah's gaze did not often fall. Thomas was its architect, his mind, once focused on joinery and plumb lines, now meticulously plotting a path through the wilderness and past the zealous guards. He identified the weakest of the ill, young Jacob, the woodcutter Abel, the seamstress, those who could not walk but might be carried on makeshift litters. He calculated the cover of darkness, the moonless nights that were their only ally, the specific game trails that would bypass the main path and its sentinels. He quietly identified those whose faith had been shattered by the reality of the sickness, whose eyes, when they met his, held not fervor, but a desperate, pleading agreement. They would need to move quickly, silently, a desperate exodus carrying the very evidence of their reason for leaving. The night of the planned escape arrived, cloaked in a deep, starless black that felt like a conspirator. A thick fog had rolled into the mountain clearing, muffling sound and reducing the world to a small, damp sphere of visibility. The camp was quieter than usual, the usual coughing fits seeming subdued, as if the sickness itself was holding its breath. Thomas and his small band of rebels moved like ghosts through the gloom. They had gathered what few supplies they could pilfer, waterskins, a little hardtack, blankets, and were in the process of carefully lifting the first litter, bearing the frail form of Jacob, when a figure materialized from the mist before them. It was Elijah. He stood alone, his face pale and severe in the darkness, his eyes burning with a cold fire. He had not been sleeping. He had been waiting, his own suspicion a sentry as effective as any guard. The standoff was silent and absolute, a tableau of opposing truths frozen in the damp, cold air. On one side stood Thomas and his rebels, their faces set in grim determination, their hands gripping the poles of the litters that bore the tangible reason for their heresy. Behind them, the other followers who had chosen to leave huddled together, their fear a palpable force. On the other side stood Elijah, a solitary figure who nonetheless seemed to block the entire world, his authority a wall as real as the mountains surrounding them. He did not speak at first, his gaze sweeping over the traders, the sick, the supplies. The disappointment and fury in his eyes were more devastating than any curse. This was the ultimate schism, the physical manifestation of the doubt he had fought so hard to extinguish. Then he spoke, his voice low but carrying through the fog with the chilling clarity of a funeral bell. He did not plead or command them to stay. He pronounced a judgment. He called them the faithless, the ones who had failed the final test, who were abandoning God's covenant at the very threshold of salvation. He spoke of the fire flood that would surely find them in the outside world, a world he condemned as already damned. His words were meant to shatter their resolve, to fill them with a terror greater than the one they carried in their lungs. And for some, it worked. A few of the figures on the edge of the group, those who had been swaying on the precipice of decision, faltered. They looked from Elijah's terrifying certainty to the dark, unknown woods, and the fear of divine retribution proved stronger than the fear of a consumptive death. They took a step back, melting away from the rebels and back into the mist, choosing the known hell of the camp over the uncertain perils of a world under God's wrath. But others held firm. They were the ones who had held the heads of the feverish, who had wiped the blood from pale lips, who had seen the light of prophecy gutter and die in the face of tangible, wasting suffering. Mary stood beside Thomas, her hand on her son's litter, her face a mask of resolute grief. She did not look at Elijah. Her entire world had shrunk to the labored rise and fall of Jacob's chest. Her choice was made. The others who remained with Thomas were the carpenters and farmers whose hands were used to fixing real problems, whose faith had been built on practical charity, not apocalyptic fear. They looked past the preacher, their eyes fixed on the dark line of the forest, on the path that led to medicine, to doctors, to a chance, however slim, for life. The community was now irrevocably split, a chasm carved not by doctrine, but by the stark, simple choice between a prophet's dream and a dying child's breath. In the heavy silence that followed Elijah's condemnation, the only sounds were the ragged coughing of the sick and the determined shuffle of feet as the rebels, carrying their precious, suffering cargo, began their desperate journey into the unknown dark. The silence left in the wake of the rebels' departure was heavier than any sermon, more damning than any prophecy. It was a physical weight that pressed down on the clearing, suffocating the remaining followers and hollowing out the space where their faith had once resided. The skeletal ark stood as a grotesque monument to their folly, its unfinished ribs clawing at a sky the color of bruised flesh. Elijah stood where the rebels had vanished into the fog, his body rigid, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. The defiant fire in his eyes had not extinguished, but it had turned inward, feeding on a fuel of crumbling certainty and rising panic. He could feel the gazes of those who had stayed upon his back, not looks of devotion now, but of desperate, questioning fear. They had stayed, but their trust was a fragile thread, fraying with every ragged cough that still echoed from the shelters. He turned slowly to face them, his movements stiff, like a marionette with tangled strings. Their faces were a gallery of his failure, pale, gaunt, etched with the lines of illness and a dawning, terrible realization. They had given him everything: their homes, their labor, their health, their families. They had believed in his vision with a ferocity that had sustained him, that had made the dream feel as real as the wood in his hands. But now, with the tangible evidence of Thomas's rebellion and the undeniable reality of the sickness surrounding them, the foundation of that belief was collapsing into dust. The grand narrative of divine purpose was unraveling, and all that was left was the stark, ugly truth of their situation. Trapped, sick, and abandoned in the mountains. The pressure built inside Elijah's chest, a tectonic shifting of guilt and fear that he could no longer contain. It was no longer a question of if it would break him, but when. The dam burst not with a roar, but with a shuddering, broken exhalation. His shoulders, which had always been squared with prophetic authority, slumped forward as if the weight of the sky had settled upon them. He looked at his followers, truly looked at them, and for the first time he did not see the chosen but victims. Victims of his loneliness, his need, his desperate, grasping hunger for purpose. His voice, when it finally came, was a ruined thing, stripped of its resonant power, cracked and whisper-thin. He did not speak of God or fire or salvation. He spoke of a man, a lonely man in a cabin, listening to the wind howl like the voice of his own isolation. He confessed to the dream, yes, but he stripped it of its divinity. He described it not as a vision, but as a feverish fantasy born of a deep, aching emptiness, a mind starved for connection weaving a grand tapestry from the threads of its own despair. The command to build the ark had felt real, so terrifyingly real, because he had wanted it to be. He had needed a purpose so colossal it would fill the void inside him, a mission that would make his solitude meaningful. The fear in their eyes, the fervor he had cultivated, the very sickness that now consumed them, it had all been kindling for a fire he had built to warm his own cold soul. As he spoke, the carefully constructed persona of the prophet shattered, falling away like shards of painted pottery to reveal the fragile, broken man beneath. Tears, hot and shameful, carved tracks through the grime on his cheeks. His body trembled with the force of his confession, his words tumbling out in a raw, agonized torrent of regret. He spoke of his own terror, the cold dread that had haunted him every time a follower looked at him with absolute trust, the crushing weight of a responsibility he had invented for himself. He had not been leading them to salvation. He had been leading them into the reflection of his own profound brokenness, and the true flood was not one of fire, but of the consequences now drowning them all. The followers were stunned into a silence more profound than any he had ever commanded with his sermons. The air itself seemed to still, the very forest holding its breath. The trust they had placed in him, the bedrock of their new lives, did not just fracture. It vaporized, leaving behind a vacuum of disbelief and a cold, sharp anger. The grand design was a delusion. The divine mission was a lie. The ark was not a vessel of salvation, but a tomb built on the foundation of one man's loneliness, and they were the willing captives who had helped him construct it. The community's spirit, already weakened by sickness and division, shattered completely, leaving behind only the hollow, aching truth of their collective folly, laid bare by the broken preacher's tears. The rebels moved like phantoms through the grasping dark, their progress a desperate, silent prayer against the groaning of the litters and the ragged symphony of the sick. Each crunch of a foot on a twig, Each stifled cough from the bundled forms they carried felt like a thunderclap in the fog-muffled silence, a beacon to the zealous guards they knew were still out there, somewhere in the gloom. Thomas led the way, his senses stretched taut, navigating not by sight but by a deep, instinctual memory of the land, choosing paths that were more animal trail than human passage, routes of roots and steep inclines that would deter any pursuit. The weight of the litters, bearing Jacob, Abel, and the young seamstress, was a brutal, physical reminder of the stakes. It was not just their own freedom they carried, but the fragile, feverish lives entrusted to their haste and their silence. Behind them, the camp, with its towering skeletal ark and its broken preacher, faded into the swallowing mist, becoming less a place and more a nightmare they were fleeing. The journey was a slow-motion agony, a test of endurance that dwarfed even the hardest days of ark building. Muscles, already depleted by weeks of poor food and relentless labor, screamed in protest. The rough-hewn litters dug into shoulders, and hands grew raw and numb from their desperate grips. Mary walked beside her son's litter, one hand constantly on his burning forehead, her every sense focused on the shallow, rattling rhythm of his breath. Her world had shrunk to this: the feel of his fever, the sound of his struggle, the next painful step forward. The grand purpose that had once filled her with holy fire was now ashes, blown away by the cold wind of reality, replaced by a single, primal drive. Get him to help. Every stumble, every moment of hesitation from the others, sent a fresh jolt of terror through her. They were a chain of desperate humanity, each link forged in fear and a shared, grim determination, inching their way through the oppressive dark toward a hope that felt as faint as the distant, unseen stars. Back in the clearing, the silence was a living entity, heavy and suffocating. The rebels were gone, but their absence was a louder presence than their bodies had ever been. It was a void that echoed with the truth of Elijah's confession. The few followers who had remained stood or sat in isolated huddles, not looking at each other, not looking at the ark, their faces blank with a shock too profound for anger or grief. They were the shipwrecked survivors of a sunken faith, cast adrift on a sea of their own making. And in the center of the wreckage stood Elijah. The charismatic prophet was gone, the commanding presence vaporized, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell of a man. He did not pray. He did not speak. He simply stood, his gaze fixed on the empty space where the trail vanished into the trees, his shoulders slumped under an invisible, crushing weight. The guilt was a physical acid, eating him from the inside, each ragged cough from the followers who had stayed with him a fresh indictment. He had offered them a covenant with God and had given them only a pact with his own delusion. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, revealing the full, pathetic scope of the abandoned camp, the true tragedy of his obsession was laid bare. Not everyone had been strong enough or had enough willing hands to be carried to freedom. In one of the smaller, draftier shelters lay an old man named Hezekiah and his wife, Ruth. Both were deep in the throes of the fever, too weak to even lift their heads, their breathing a wet, labored whisper. They had been among the first to believe, their simple, unwavering faith a cornerstone of the early community. Now they were left behind, not by God's selection, but by the brutal, practical limitations of a desperate escape. They were the final, damning consequence, the human cost of a dream that had curdled into a nightmare. Their quiet suffering in the cold morning light was a more powerful sermon against Elijah's folly than any Thomas could have preached. They were the chosen, left to face not a flood of fire, but the slow, lonely, and utterly mundane end that his grand vision had wrought. Weeks later, a fragile quiet had settled over the mountains, a stillness that felt less like peace and more like exhaustion. The frantic energy of prophecy and the ragged sounds of sickness had both been swallowed by the immense, indifferent patience of the wilderness. The disease, identified by the town doctor as a virulent strain of tuberculosis, had been contained, but at a cost that was measured in fresh graves on the outskirts of Pine Creek. Some, like young Jacob and the seamstress, clung to a tenuous recovery in clean beds, their bodies slowly wrestling the invader into a wary truce. Others, like the woodcutter Abel and the elderly couple left behind, had lost the fight, their names now whispered with a mixture of grief and a lingering, unanswerable question. The community that had ventured into the woods as one was now a collection of scattered survivors, bound by a shared trauma that was too raw to be called a bond. Deep in the woods, the clearing remained, but the sacred workshop had reverted to what it always was, a part of the forest. The unfinished ark stood at its center, a grotesque and haunting monument to human folly. Rain had warped the exposed timbers, and a pale, fuzzy mold crept up its skeletal ribs. Weeds and saplings had already begun to reclaim the churned earth at its base, nature patiently stitching its green fabric back over the wound. The massive keel, once blessed as the spine of salvation, was now just a rotting log, its curve sagging under its own weight. It was a ship that would never know water, a sanctuary that had offered no shelter, its silent, decaying hulk a more potent sermon on the dangers of fanaticism than any Elijah had ever delivered. Hunters and trappers who stumbled upon it would later speak of it in hushed tones. A ghost ship stranded in a sea of trees, a local legend born of madness and despair. Elijah was found by a search party days after the escape, not in his cabin, but sitting on the stone altar in the abandoned clearing, staring at the ark as if waiting for it to finally speak and reveal its true purpose. He was emaciated, his clothes hanging from his frame, his eyes vacant pools in a face carved deep with shame. There was no fight left in him, no divine fire, only a profound and broken stillness. He offered no resistance as they led him away, a prophet without a vision, a shepherd who had led his flock to the cliff's edge. He was taken in by a distant, sympathetic cousin in a neighboring county, a quiet man who asked no questions and offered no judgments, only a roof and a bed. In the slow, gray passage of those first weeks of his confinement, Elijah had nothing but the legacy of his actions to reflect upon. The cost of his folly was a ledger written in graves and broken lives. He saw Mary's face, not filled with the holy joy he had once inspired, but etched with the terrible fear for her son. He heard Thomas's pragmatic voice, the voice of reason he had branded as faithlessness, which had ultimately been the voice of salvation. He had been so consumed by the grandeur of his divine narrative that he had become blind to the humble, earthly truths of medicine and compassion. His faith, which he had believed was a ladder to heaven, had been a wall he built between himself and reality, a wall that had trapped and endangered everyone who trusted him. The lesson was a brutal one, carved into his soul with the sharp tools of consequence. That true faith was not a shield against the world's suffering, but a call to engage with it with open eyes and a humble heart, to discern between the whisper of God and the roaring need of one's own lonely soul. The ark stood as his eternal reminder, a testament not to divine purpose, but to the terrifying price of confusing the two.